Two houses, same neighborhood, same builder, same summer. One attic runs 10 degrees cooler than the other. Both have a radiant barrier installed. $30 of aluminum foil stapled 3/4 of an inch off the roof deck in one house does nothing in the other. The foil is the same. The result is not. Here's the thing nobody tells you at the hardware store. That shiny roll of aluminum is not insulation. It does not slow heat the way a blanket slows heat. It works on a completely different physical principle, one that requires air, not contact. Touch it to a surface, and you have spent your weekend installing a very expensive mirror that faces a wall. The mechanism demands a gap, and if you did not know that going in, you're probably in the majority of people who installed it wrong. What gets lost when the installation fails is not dramatic. There is no burst pipe, no mold, no obvious sign of damage. What you lose is quiet and cumulative. According to Oak Ridge National Laboratory research cited by the Department of Energy, a correctly installed radiant barrier in a hot climate can reduce coolant loads by 5 to 10% annually. The Department of Energy also notes that tested reductions in attic heat gain in hot climates have ranged from 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit under controlled conditions. That translates, in a 2,000 square foot home in a climate like Texas or Florida, to savings that compound across every summer you own the house. The Department of Energy reports those savings as typically ranging from $100 to $150 per year in high heat regions. Multiply that by 10 years. Multiply it by the fact that radiant barriers, when properly maintained, last the life of the roof structure. Then imagine you stapled yours flat against the roof deck on a Saturday afternoon 4 years ago. You have spent 4 cooling seasons paying for an installation that never performed. The foil is still up there. The savings are not. Most people get this wrong for a reason that is completely logical. Insulation works by contact. You push fiberglass bats between studs, and the contact is the point. The more the material touches the surfaces around it, the better the thermal resistance. That mental model, correct for every other insulating material in your house, is the exact wrong model for radiant barriers. When you carry it into the attic and staple the foil against the roof sheathing, you're applying a rule that does not belong, and the hardware store instructions do not help. They often say something like, "Install on the underside of the roof rafters," without specifying what that means geometrically. Does the foil go against the wood? Does it hang between the rafters? Does it drape down from the ridge? The instructions assume you already understand the underlying physics. Most homeowners do not, because the physics is counterintuitive in a specific and costly way. The salesperson who helped you pick the roll almost certainly described it in terms of reflection. That part is accurate. But reflection requires something to reflect from, and it requires a destination for the reflected energy. If the foil is pressed flat against a solid surface, there is no space for the reflection to happen. The energy that arrives at the foil face has nowhere to go except into the foil itself, and from the foil directly into whatever it is touching. The gap is not a nice to have, it is the product. Here is what is actually happening inside a hot attic, and why the gap matters at the level of physics. On a summer afternoon, your roof deck can reach 150 degrees Fahrenheit, or higher, according to Oak Ridge National Laboratory research into building envelope thermal performance. That hot surface radiates energy in the form of infrared waves downward into the attic space. This radiation moves through air without heating the air. It strikes whatever surface it encounters next, and that surface absorbs it and heats up. If that next surface is your attic floor, which is the top of your ceiling and the bottom of your living space insulation, the heat conducts through and raises the temperature inside your house. A radiant barrier interrupts that process by reflecting the infrared energy before it reaches the attic floor. But the reflection depends entirely on a property called emissivity. Emissivity is a measure of how readily a surface emits thermal radiation. A perfect emitter has an emissivity of 1. A perfect reflector has an emissivity of 0. Standard aluminum foil used in radiant barriers has an emissivity at or below 0.06, as measured under ASTM C1313 test conditions, with typical field values between 0.03 and 0.06, depending on surface condition and age. A radiant barrier with emissivity below 0.1, as defined by ASTM C1313, reflects the large majority of incident long-wave radiation. According to Oak Ridge National Laboratory research cited by the Department of Energy, tested reductions in attic heat gain in hot climates have ranged from 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit under controlled conditions. That reflective performance is only valid when there's an air gap between the foil and the radiating surface. When the foil touches the roof deck directly, the energy transfers by conduction, not radiation, and emissivity becomes irrelevant. Conduction does not care about emissivity. It moves heat from molecule to molecule regardless of how shiny the surface is. The foil, now in direct contact with the surface at 150 degrees, conducts heat into itself and radiates that heat downward into the attic exactly as the roof deck would have done without it. The Department of Energy building envelope guidelines are explicit on this point. An air gap is required on at least one side of the radiant barrier. 2 sides is better. According to Department of Energy installation guidance, the barrier needs at least 3/4 of an inch on each side, with better thermal performance above 1.5 inches. That gap requirement. That is the difference between an attic that runs 10 degrees cooler and one that does not change at all. Now, here's the second variable, and this one hits installations that started out correct. Dust. A radiant barrier that was properly installed with a clean air gap on both sides will, over time, accumulate a layer of dust on the upward-facing surface. Attics are not sealed environments. Air moves through them continuously, and that air carries fine particulate matter that settles on every horizontal surface. The foil surface is no exception. According to research published by Oak Ridge National Laboratory, a layer of dust 1/16 of an inch thick is sufficient to raise the emissivity of a radiant barrier surface from approximately 0.03 to values approaching 0.9. That is effectively the emissivity of an uncoated surface. Read that again slowly. A thin film of dust, the kind you would barely notice if you ran a finger across the foil, can convert a low emissivity surface into something that behaves almost identically to bare wood. The emissivity value nearly triples, then quadruples, and keeps climbing as the dust accumulates year over year. This is why radiant barriers installed on the attic floor, facing upward, almost always underperform expectations within 2 to 3 years. The upward-facing surface collects dust by gravity alone. Installations where the barrier hangs from the rafters with the reflective face pointing down toward the attic floor perform significantly better over time because the downward-facing surface collects far less dust. That orientation also naturally creates the required air gap between the foil and the roof deck above. The combination of these two failure modes, no air gap on installation and dust accumulation over time, explains most of the difference between homeowners who report meaningful savings and homeowners who report nothing. The product works. The installation and maintenance are where the value either appears or disappears. Before you decide whether to reinstall, clean, or walk away, you need to spend about 10 minutes in your attic. Take a flashlight and something flat, like a ruler or a stiff card. You're looking for two things in a specific order. First, find where the radiant barrier is attached. If it is stapled directly against the roof decking, with no daylight visible between the foil and the wood when you shine the light at a low angle, that is a contact installation. It is not performing as a radiant barrier regardless of how shiny it looks. Second, if there is a visible gap, examine the upward-facing surface. Run a finger across it. If you come away with gray or brown dust, or if the surface looks matte rather than mirror bright, you are looking at a degraded emissivity value and a measurable reduction in performance. If your barrier is touching the roof deck, you need to reinstall it. If your barrier has an adequate gap but the surface is dusty, cleaning is your first step before any other action. According to Oak Ridge National Laboratory performance data, both problems are correctable without replacing the barrier itself. The material is not the failure. The conditions around the material are. There is one more factor worth checking before you buy anything or move anything. Look at your existing attic insulation. If your attic floor already has at least 12 inches of blown-in insulation, or the equivalent in batts, according to Department of Energy guidelines for climate zones 3 and above, the contribution of a radiant barrier to your overall cooling load reduction becomes smaller. A barrier reduces radiant gain. Deep insulation reduces conductive gain. Both matter, but in a well-insulated attic, the marginal benefit of the barrier is lower than in an under-insulated one. That does not mean it is not worth doing. It means understanding what problem you are actually solving before spending time or money. Now, for the sequence of corrections, starting with what costs nothing. If your barrier has an air gap and is only dusty, clean it. A soft bristle brush attached to a long pole, the kind sold for cleaning ceiling fans, will remove surface dust without damaging the foil. Work carefully. Foil tears easily, and a torn barrier loses reflective surface area. Do this every 2 to 3 years, particularly on any upward-facing surfaces. This is free, and according to Oak Ridge National Laboratory performance data, restoring the emissivity from a dusty state back to clean aluminum can recover most of the original reflective performance. If the barrier is in direct contact with the roof deck, you will need to reinstall it. The materials cost roughly $30 for a standard roll covering a typical attic bay arrangement. Reattach the barrier so it hangs freely between the rafters, rather than pressing against the sheathing. Use staples only at the edges and at rafter faces, never across the face of the foil, and allow the material at least 3/4 of an inch of clearance on each side, aiming above 1.5 inches when the rafter depth allows, according to Department of Energy installation guidance. This single correction can move the installation from zero functional benefit to near full performance. If you're building new or doing a full re-roofing project and have the option to choose, a foil-faced roof deck underlayment installed with a furring strip air gap creates the most durable long-term performance because the reflective surface faces downward into the attic, collects minimal dust, and is protected from foot traffic during maintenance work. This approach typically adds $200 to $300 to a roofing project at installation, but does not require any subsequent reinstallation. Now, what not to do. Do not staple the barrier flat against the roof deck. This is the single most common mistake, and it produces zero radiation blocking benefit. Do not install it with the shiny face pointing upward on the attic floor as the primary barrier, because the dust accumulation on that face will degrade performance within a few years, regardless of how clean your attic air seems. Do not assume that because the product label shows a low emissivity rating under ASTM C1313 lab conditions, that number applies to your installation as you have it. That rating assumes clean foil with air gaps on both sides. Your installation may share none of those conditions. And finally, if you live in a cold climate, a climate zone 5 or above, according to the Department of Energy climate map, a radiant barrier is likely not worth the effort. The gains from blocking summer radiant heat are real but modest, and in a predominantly heating climate, the energy cost problem sits on the other side of the thermal equation entirely. According to the Department of Energy, the majority of radiant barrier energy benefit accrues in climate zones 1 through 3, where summer cooling dominates the annual energy budget. Insulation depth, air sealing, and window glazing return more per dollar in cold climates than a radiant barrier will. Spend the $30 on a can of expanding foam and a tube of acoustic sealant instead. $30. That gap. One surface that has to stay clean. The barrier has not changed since you bought it. What changes is whether it has the air it needs to do the only job it was ever designed to do. The aluminum did not change, but where it sits and whether anything is touching it changed everything. Go into your attic and check your radiant barrier right now. Is there a visible air gap on both sides, or is it resting against something? Tell me what you find in the comments.